So today we're going to do a couple things, and I'm really appreciative of our guests and excited that they're joining us. We're first going to bring in Michael Seman, and Michael, thanks for joining us. We had you on the program in the summer when you were releasing some Colorado state data, specifically around the music community and what was happening with the economic impact on music. You, in August when we were on break, worked with Richard Florida to release some expanded data that's looking more broadly at the economic impact on kind of the creative sector more globally in terms of United States cities, and released that report through the Brookings Institute. And really, it's very important work, and it's data driven, and it underlines and really amplifies everything that we've been talking about sort of instinctively. So Michael, again, thank you for joining us. I appreciate you making time here, and let's start with just a little bit about what are your findings, kind of what is the data showing, and maybe you could share some of your top line stuff.
Sure. If you'd like, I can go through I have a PowerPoint, some slides I put together just to hit the high
That'd be great. Yep, that'd be great.
Look at how this is affecting metro areas as well and possible way forward. So let me share my screen. Well, thank you. First, thank you, Michael, for hosting me, and it's great to see everyone virtually. As Michael had said, I was on the show back in July, and I basically started to look at how COVID was affecting the creative economy in Colorado and Denver. It was a very quick thing I had to jump into. It was mid-March is when I started this work. And it went from just looking at the music industry quickly to the entire creative economy for the state and for the city of Denver. What happened is, as I was doing this, I occasionally work with Richard, and we thought, well, perhaps we should look at the entire country. This could actually be something that could help frame the situation, and we knew it was going to be terrible. Now, what I'd like to do today is let me go through basically how this came together, and I can give you then the overview, and then we can drill down and look more at the metro regions and how they have little variations, which are very interesting. And then we can finish up with, what's the way forward. So I started this project basically mid-March. I quickly went from Colorado to looking at the entire country and the top 53 metropolitan regions of 1 million plus. This was very challenging in that it was unfolding in real time. It's my first global pandemic, so there was a lot of research on the ground and on the fly that I was doing, and let me sort of give you a little insight on that. Basically, for the Colorado edition, I created a static economic model. And then when Richard and I started to look nationwide, we tweaked it a little bit to really sort of encompass everything across the country. First thing is there's no precedent in literature to address this. The closest was a natural disaster. So basically think of this as a Hurricane Katrina or maybe a Kobe earthquake in Japan in 1995, something that completely shuts down an economy, but it's happening in every single region all at once, and not just in the country, but globally. So this was a very challenging situation to put in perspective, because it's not just the creative industries that were being affected. It's one thing to look at, say, oil in the Permian Basin. If the price per barrel goes down, how does that affect there? This is every industry and how it interacts, and then how it interacts with the creative economy. I conducted informal interviews with people in the industries and get perspectives published via media outlets, private firms, government agencies. I was constantly calling and reading as much as I possibly could. I took into consideration the effects of local and statewide stay-at-home and safer-at-home orders, and this is across the country, and the closing of non-essential businesses. Again, I was starting this in March, looking nationwide at early April, so this was a lot of estimations. It started with live events, thinking that they might come back in the fall. It quickly became that live events at full capacity probably wouldn't happen until 2021 at the earliest. We assumed access to federal stimulus funds for firms, establishments, self-employed. I know that there was, at the time, predicted 24% annualized contraction of the U.S. economy, with an average of 14% unemployment in quarter two. That's the underlying economic data points that I was using to inform the entire work. Now, keep in mind, this includes people that are laid off, furloughed, temporary laid off, those working freelance jobs, the self-employed, they have lost gigs. The creative economy is always tough to wrangle because it's so much variables in terms of the jobs people hold. So in some cases, I knew that some of these jobs would come back. In other cases, it would be 6 months until some of these jobs came back. So I had to think of all of that and look at basically 111 industries in 9 industry clusters. So again, this was a very large challenge to as accurately model as I could possibly get. And so far, things, in some cases, unfortunately, are bearing what I predicted. So let's look. Between April 1st and July 31st, these are the estimations that we came up with. Basically, in the 9 clusters, a total estimated jobs loss of 2.7 million and total estimated sales revenue loss of about 157 billion. Now that's just between April 1st and July 31st. And again, it includes people that are temporarily laid off, people that have lost gigs, self-employed that all of a sudden lost jobs. This is also the creative industry. So we're talking not just, if you're looking at an advertising firm, it's not just the graphic designer or the art director, it's also the receptionist or perhaps the accountant in the firm as well. Basically, all of these jobs are driven by creativity. Now, to put this in perspective, the sample month in the creative economy, as I defined it, has about 8.8 million jobs and around 142 billion in sales in the creative economy. So for the creative industries, these losses represent 31% of all employment and 9% of annual sales just in these 4 months. And perhaps, especially in terms of music, the most important fact is if you look at fine and performing arts, that was by far the most employment and revenue losses, but that's 50% of these jobs lost are in the fine and performing arts, and a large part of that is music. Now, if we're just talking about creative occupations, this is important to note. So creative occupations are the core creative people who are in creative occupations. So you have the graphic designer, architect, archivist, illustrators, video editors. These people may be employed in the creative industries or other industries like retail, aerospace, transportation, information technology. The important thing to get your head around in terms of the creative economy writ large is it's not only an economic powerhouse in its own right in many regions, it also helps drive your region's entire economy. So you have the graphic designer that's working at an airline, they have a good chance of having a lost job. Southwest Air Magazine, if you've ever flown on that, I had friends work there, that was one of the first things they immediately cut, and that was several jobs just within days of the pandemic taking hold. Now, in this case, it was an estimated loss of about 2.3 million jobs and 74 billion in average monthly earnings. This represents about 30% of all jobs in the creative occupations and 15% of total average monthly wages annually, all within that 4-month period. Again, the fine and performing arts sector is disproportionately affected, and it represents an estimated 34% of all employment losses and 35% of all earnings lost. So keep in mind, the creative occupations, you could be employed, say, in an actual creative firm, or you could be employed or doing work for a firm that is in an entirely different industry. So again, it's woven throughout the region, and this is why it's such a serious situation for many places. But let's look at the metro areas. Now, these were very interesting data, and it kind of went 2 ways. But the first thing is I looked at the top 53 metro areas in the country, and that is a population of 1 million or more. And 80% of all losses in sales nationwide, sales of goods and services, were in these metro areas. 68% of all the jobs lost nationwide were in these metro areas. So the creative economy, although it can be found in rural areas, it can be found in suburban regions, basically it is still of heavily urban, an urban region concentration. The top 10 metro areas combined represent 55% of all losses in sales and revenue nationwide, 37% of all jobs lost nationwide. So again, we're talking about not only is it concentrated in regions, it's really concentrated in the top 10 metro areas nationwide. The New York and Los Angeles metros alone combined for $50 billion in lost sales and revenue and over 500,000 jobs lost. 34% of all losses in sales nationwide and 18% of all jobs lost nationwide. So as common thought usually goes, New York and Los Angeles still the creative capitals of the country. But honestly, of the 53 metro areas, you're looking at 80% of sales lost, 68% of jobs lost. Cities all over the country have healthy creative economies before COVID-19 crisis. So this is another reason why this is extremely important to address on a nationwide level, because it permeates the entire country. But what is interesting is when Richard and I thought, well, how is this affecting regions in terms of percentage loss? Because of course, New York and Los Angeles, they have enormous creative economies in terms of the number of jobs, the sales revenue. But what about a smaller region? How is their creative economy more susceptible or less susceptible to the COVID-19 crisis? Well, when you look at the actual percentage of jobs lost, it told a different story. So the national average for estimated jobs lost in the creative industries was about 31.9%. So most metro areas, their creative industries contracted in terms of employment by about 31.9% within that 4-month period, which, in general, when you're talking about anything in economics, a 3% change one way or the other is pretty healthy. So this is, again, we're talking fairly catastrophic estimations. But when you look at the percentage in terms of the employment and not just sheer size, metro areas like Las Vegas, Nashville, Tucson, New Orleans, Orlando, Houston, they actually were much more impacted than Los Angeles and New York. And this is, at the same time, places like San Francisco, Seattle, and San Jose fell to the bottom. They actually fared better in terms of the size of the creative economy lost within the region. So this speaks to the varied concentration of creative industries, and in some cases a tourism mix. So if you look at Las Vegas, they have a much higher percentage of independent artists, fine and performing arts, and it's also intertwined with their tourism industry. And this speaks in general too, the creative economy in these regions, it really differs, and it can be intertwined and woven within other industries in different ways. Nashville is a great example of having both tourism based on the creative economy, but also being a juggernaut in and of itself in the music industry segment. And the thing to think of too is there's a lot of dynamic angles to this. So when you're looking at the creative industries, it's not one monolithic thing. They all operate in different ways. And one thing I was starting to find was like the music industry. Well, it didn't lose, I didn't estimate that it would be losing jobs at the same capacity in every single facet of the industry. So at first, promoters kept their full staffs because they thought, we're going to have live events again in the fall. I need to reschedule all these shows. I need to rebook things. Whereas on the opposite side, you have music venues that had to immediately cut staff for the most part because there was absolutely no money coming in. no money was coming into the promoters as well, but they had to think a little bit differently into the future. And that, unfortunately, as we all know, quickly changed into laying people off at agencies and promoters because they realized that live music wasn't coming back anytime soon. Same way with film. Live shoots were immediately halted, and many jobs were lost. If you're a director, you could have easily lost a big job immediately. Whereas if you're in post-production, you still had many things in the pipeline, and you were actually, in some cases, busier than you were before. But now, from what I understand, in July, in August, you started to see a slowdown because there isn't anything in the pipeline. So actually, as some productions start to ramp up in a limited capacity, the post-production is actually ramping down. And then there's a situation with places like Netflix, knowing that they don't have anything in the pipeline, they now have to buy as much content as they can, so they have new releases and such to promote when there actually isn't anything being made in the pipeline. So you have a director that, one anecdotal story, a director that originally was turned down by Netflix to buy a property, coming back and saying, hey, you know what, we changed our minds, we would like to buy that. The creative industries was all different in different levels. In terms of San Francisco, Seattle, and San Jose, they were much more reliant on creative technology cluster, and that really wasn't as affected as much by COVID-19 as the live and performing arts. Now, what's the way forward? Immediately, it's an all-hands-on-deck situation. You address immediate needs through partnerships amongst local, state, national government, the philanthropic sector, and private industry. And you see, thankfully, all these different programming ideas popping up. So in Colorado, we had the Colorado Music Relief Fund, which was some of people from the state of Colorado, some people from private industry like Breckenridge Brewery, then you have 7S Management, as well as the Bohemian Foundation, all coming together and raising, at last I checked, it was well over $625,000 for people that work behind the scenes in music and people that are actually the performers. Similar situation in New Jersey, Arts and Cultural Recovery Fund. There's many of these partnerships popping up, and it's really heartwarming to see because this is, a total carnage situation in terms of losses of jobs and revenue. But there's also, as Michael had talked about before, things like Save Our Stages Act, the Restart Act. Unfortunately, we're now delayed with seeing if these things will go through, but there are acts that came out immediately that we need to save infrastructure as quickly as possible. The Be an Arts Hero is a great grassroots campaign. They have now put forth the DAWN bill, which is Defend Arts Workers Now, that has immediate relief funds for artists and arts workers. That's a great situation. That's something much like NIVA, the National Independent Venue Association, that put forth the Save Our Stages Act. These are grassroots campaigns that are happening almost literally overnight, and it's great to see, and it needs to be supported in any way possible. But really what we need to talk about is the long term. This, as like I've said, the creative economy is multifaceted. It's going to be a long time before we see live events come back to the capacity that is really able to support people's careers, both behind the scenes and on the stage. Film industry is going to go through quite a bit of pains as it, the effects of COVID eventually, how should we say, diminish. But this is also something to think of. Will this be the only global pandemic we see in our lifetimes? We need to really start to think. I like to put this in the scenario of, if you watch The Wizard of Oz, at the very end, when the curtain comes back and you see actually what is happening, this is exactly what COVID has done to the entire creative economy. It's a very precarious business structure in many ways: music, theater, film. Well, there's been structural problems for decades. Now, after COVID, everyone is seeing this. So we really need to address the arts and culture in the United States, much like it's being addressed in many other countries. We need federal level programming that engages with the and underemployed creative economy workforce that I've just discussed, and also the places to foster and support it. So the idea of Save Our Stages, music venues are precarious, and we're going to lose many of them if they can't be funded soon. I highly recommend looking at the Americans for the Arts, their Put Creative Workers to Work proposal. It's fantastic. It has 15 actions that largely use existing structures and channels that already exist within the federal government, but with funding, they can then incorporate the creative economy, and all these people that are unemployed at the moment or underemployed or precariously employed because of COVID-19. It will not only help get everyone back on their feet, but it's a long-term thought of, okay, how can we develop the next level of creative economy? And it has things like, it looks at the digital strategy funds in England and Canada, and taking that idea of how to retrain and skills building of creative economy workers into the digital realm, and putting that within the United States government, some of the already some avenues that exist and infrastructure, like tweaking the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act so that it's specifically addressing creative economy workers, and basically embedding artists and designers and such within different federal departments. And there's a wide range of options, and I really highly recommend looking at that. Even things such as the Artist Corps that Obama had approved, but it never really was addressed. Now is the time.
Yep. Michael Seman, well done.
Sure.
Yeah. So thanks, everybody. It's been great to see y'all. Have a great week. We'll be back next week with more hijinks and fun. No, it's hard, right? It's hard. And, we all have so much appreciation, for the work that you and others are doing to document it and put meat behind it, because again, the challenge is, it's one thing to, sort of intuit the structural challenges and sort of the vulnerability of the sector. But when you put numbers behind it, that just gives it an entirely different weight. And I think the mix that you talk about, again, I very much appreciate that we all have to be solutions focused right now. This is not a time, just to be talking about how bad it is. And there's a real challenge that I think we all face. Obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, this is a tough time for humanity. There's a real challenge around just being overwhelmed with just sort of the existential grief around everything that's happening, and the anxiety and the fear and just everything. And it's very easy to burrow. And it's very easy to just take that internal, and it's very easy to be like, I don't know what the solutions are, and I'm just going to shut down. And we can't do that. The stakes and the risks of doing that are overwhelming. And I think, if we pivot a little bit in today's conversation, what has been, again, extremely, sort of encouraging, and hopeful, around the music community's response this year and the response of others in the creative sector is to try to get granular and try to get into an active mode. So again, we talk a lot about, NEVA deserves a lot of respect. There are a lot of other people doing a lot of really important work. And again, we have to be able to, kind of the old cliche of walk it and chew gum. We have to be able to be looking at the short term. What do we put in place today? Can we get in the September bill? Is there going to be a September bill? All that. And then we also have to be doing the aspirational piece, which is like, okay, everybody who does this work comes from a standpoint of understanding that these underlying structures are fundamentally flawed to begin with. And you mentioned this. We've all been working towards trying to trying to comprehend what actionable structural reform looks like to build better and more resilient music industry structures and music communities, and how we resource them. And the crisis just, amplifies the need to do that work. And so thinking about 2021, thinking about beyond, obviously nobody controls the election, and these issues should not be partisan. But what we know for sure, is that if the election goes the way that the numbers today on September 11th suggest it might go, then there is virtual 100% certainty that Congress and the next administration we'll be doing a major stimulus initiative in the first quarter of next year, because that is what they do. That is literally what they do. And so again, we need to be able to be thinking, what do we need in terms of mitigating the challenge, but how do we fundamentally rethink what is the role of the public sector? What does it mean in terms of policy? What does it mean in terms of funding? We think about antitrust. We need to think about all these things at once. And what, again, just gives me a lot of hope and sense of momentum is that these discussions are happening in ways that are very granular and tangible and not just theoretical, like, hey, music's important. We got to help music, fight for music. And what are you going to do to fight for music? So I want to bring in Anna Chilenza and Chris, and Michael, if you can hang on, that'd be great, because we're going to bring you in at the end just to kind of reflect back on what's happening here in DC.